Today, I'm going to speak about Lionel Trilling and his essay Freud and Literature. As we all know, Trilling was a preeminent American literary critic and public intellectual who sought to integrate nuances of psychology with the rigors of social and political thought. As a central figure of the New York intellectuals, he championed a brand of criticism that favored complexity, moral seriousness, and the liberal imagination over rigid ideologies. His work often explored the tension between the individual's internal life and the external pressures of culture or, or civilization. In, in Pride and Literature, Trilling establishes himself as a bridge between the scientific rigor of psychoanalysis and the expansive humanism of literary tradition. In Pride and Literature, Trilling establishes the historical and intellectual foundations of the relationship between psychoanalysis and literary tradition. He argues that Freud did not appear in vacuum, but he was the scientific culmination of a long-standing literary zeitgeist, Zeitgeist, that is, the epoch or the spirit of the time. Trilling begins with a bold claim that the Freudian approach is the only systematic account. The Freudian approach is the only systematic account of the human mind that is comparable in point of subtlety and complexity. He asserts that Freudian approach is the only systematic account of the human mind that is comparable in point of subtlety and complexity, of interest and tragic power, to the vast amount of psychological insight literature has amassed over centuries. Trilling contrasts the richness of great literature with the reductive feel of academic psychology textbook. That is how they are different and how at the same time they are related. What richness of great literature, that is literature and academic psychology textbooks. He suggests that Freud's ideas about human nature, the complexities of the unconscious, Freud's ideas about human nature, the complexities of the unconscious, desires, conflicts, are actually closer to the realm of art and literature. They are closer to the realm of art and literature. In other words, Freud's psychology deals with the messy, nuanced aspects of human experience that poets and novelists explore. So, Trilling implies that Freud's work is more poetic or humanistic than traditional scientific psychology, which can feel dry or reductive. So, here what he is trying to point out, literature has explored, and particularly literature tries to explore the complexities of human mind that has been explored by Sigmund Freud in his psychology. So there seems to be very close relationship between Freudian psychology and literature. Trilling is careful to note that while Freud influenced literature, literature was the primary catalyst for Freud. This is the fact that Sigmund Freud has influenced literature, and in turn, literature also influenced Sigmund Freud. So there is reciprocal influence. That is reciprocal influence. It means Freud influenced literature, and in turn, literature also influenced Sigmund Freud. He reminds the reader that Trilling reminds the reader that Freud himself was humble, accepting the fact that he was influenced by literature. I quote, poets and philosophers before me, he is admitting, he is accepting the fact. He is accepting the fact. What he is saying? He is saying that poets and philosophers before me uncovered the unconscious. They discovered unconscious. Before me, the poets and philosophers have done that. Before me, the poets and philosophers have done that job. They already have discovered unconscious. And what is my contribution? What I discovered is the scientific method. The scientific method by which the unconscious can be studied. This is my contribution. He accepts the fact. Trilling views psychoanalysis as one of the culminations of the Romanticist literature of the 19th century. He identifies several key themes from the 18th and 19th centuries that paved the way for Freud, particularly 19th century and 18th century, that influenced Freud so much. Trilling cites Diderot's Rameau's nephew as a pivotal text for the perception of the hidden element of human nature and the realization that there is a conflict between the hidden and visible. During the 19th century, writers began to champion the anarchic and self-indulgent id over the utilitarian ego. They started dealing with the unconscious mind or the elements which are stored in our unconscious mind, showing a growing obsessions with the primitive and the instinctual. Primitive and the instinctual. Freud didn't just mention Diderot's Rameau's nephew. He treated it as a profound psychological pre-discovery. Referenced the work most famously in his introductory lecture on psychoanalysis. He used a specific scandalous quote from the dialogue to illustrate one of his most controversial theories, the Oedipus complex. In Diderot's dialogue, the character of the nephew is cynical, uninhibited figure who gives voice to the dark, repressed impulses of the human id before Freud had even named it. Freud focuses on this specific line from the Rameau's nephew by Diderot. Okay, this is the quote from the most famous work by Diderot, that is Rameau's nephew. If the little savage were left to himself, if the little savage were left to himself, keeping all his foolishness and adding to the small mindedness of a child. In the cradle, the violent passions of a man of 30, he would strangle his father and sleep with his mother. This is how hidden motives or instincts that the human being possess and which are pushed down into the unconscious mind. So this line is very representative of the fact of the instincts that human being normally possess. Trilling acknowledges that much of Freud's thought has a significant affinity with anti-rationalist element of the Romanticist tradition. At the same time, however, he asserts that the system itself is militantly rationalistic. It's not irrational. It is not anti-rationalist. Freud was not anti-rationalist. He was rather militantly rationalistic. Trilling critiques Thomas Mann for suggesting that the rationalistic side of psychoanalysis is secondary and even accidental, while Mann presents a Freud committed to the night side, that is, the dark side of life. Trilling insists that the rationalistic element of Freud is foremost. He is underlining this fact. Trilling is underlining the fact that the rationalistic element of Freud is foremost, most important, dominant. Before everything else, he is positivistic. Freud fiercely opposed those who tried to sophisticate with metaphysics the scientific principles that govern the 19th century. Trilling explains that the specific aim of analysis is to strengthen, make the ego strong, to make it more independent of the superego. That was the primary aim of logic. Ego stands for rationalism. That is the rationalistic faculty of mind. And he wanted to make it stronger to deal with id, which is chaotic and irrational. Trilling quotes Freud's foundational principle: where id was, that is where all the irrational, non-logical, pleasure-seeking dark forces were, there ego shall be. Where there is id, there will ego be. That is intelligence and control. So the very function of ego is to control irrational and chaotic elements in unconscious mind, that is id. Trilling appreciates Freud's drive to help people through therapy and his goal of making people happier. However, he points out that Freud's early work was rooted in a pretty straightforward, almost naive scientific mindset. So, Trilling here supporting Sigmund Freud on one hand, but at the same time, he is also critiquing him or criticizing him for certain faults or weaknesses in his theory. For Freud seemed to believe his theories directly matched reality. So, Trilling does not believe in all this, like they were objective facts. So, this is the objection that Trilling takes as regard to the claim by Sigmund Freud. The thing is, Freud applied this scientific approach to art and literature, viewing art as a sort of lesser fictional thing compared to hard science. So Trilling feels that Sigmund Freud tried to undermine literature. Trilling is highlighting the tension between Freud's scientific rationalism and his views on art. And his views on art. Trilling analyzes Freud's categorization of art, noting that Freud's views literary men as precursors and coadjutors of his own science because of their insights into hidden motives. However, Freud's informal definition of art is less flattering. Freud admitted that literary people are the writers. Literary people means the writers dealt with the dark side of mind. The dark side of mind. They dealt with the unconscious mind, the unconscious element of mind. However, Trilling claims that Freud tried to undermine art and literature. So he said that his views about art is not very flattering, is less flattering rather, he says. Freud defines art as substitute gratification. He said that art is substitute gratification. It's not real, it is substitute. Substitute, we all know, we use one thing in place of other. It means that it is secondary. And therefore, the gratification that we get from art and literature is substitute gratification. And an illusion in contrast to reality. And an illusion in contrast to reality. He describes the effect of art as being something of a narcotic and suggests it shares the characteristics of the dream involving a sort of inner dishonesty. Consequently, Freud places the artist in the same category with the neurotic. So this is very strange because neurotic does not have all his senses intact. Neurotic does not function under consciousness. Neurotic is not aware of the things around him fully well. It doesn't mean that he is not completely unaware, but then he loses or they lose touch with reality somewhere. That is, Trilling claims that Freud only looked at art just for pleasure. Art simply gives us pleasure. Poetry simply gives us pleasure. And we get a kind of gratification, and that too is secondary, that is substitute gratification. So, whatever the poets write, many times it happens that it is a sort of, he says, inner dishonesty. Trilling asserts crucial difference. He asserts crucial difference. The poet is in command of his own fantasy. The poet is in command of his own fantasy, while it is exactly the mark of the neurotic that he is possessed by his fantasy. This is very important claim. The poet, though they have the fantasies, for example, all the repressed desires suppressed instincts or imagination. The poets use the material of the unconscious mind for creative activity. The poet is in full command over all these elements. This is Trilling's argument. Because why he is making this claim? Because Freud has likened the poet to a neurotic. But Trilling is making very powerful claim. What he is saying, Trilling says that the poet is in full command of his own fantasy. Fantasy we all talked about. All suppress, repress, desire, instincts, even imagination. The poet has total command over all these elements. While it is exactly the mark of the neurotic that he is possessed by his fantasy. The poet or the artist actively engages with and shapes their fantasies, using them creatively. In contrast, on the contrary, the neurotic is controlled by their fantasies. They are possessed by them. They are possessed by them, unable to manage or direct them, as does the poet or the artist. In this context, fantasies refers to unconscious thought, desires, or imaginings that shape a person's inner world. Think of it like daydreams, creative impulses, or repressed desires that bubble up from the unconscious. Trilling claims that while Freud acknowledges art's usefulness as a therapeutic release of tension and a substitute gratification that reconciles men to the sacrifices of culture, his foundational understanding is flawed. It is wrong. It is flawed. Trilling's ultimate verdict on this section is that Freud's ideas could tell us something about art, but Freud's very conception of art is inadequate. He suggests that Freud's rigid division between practical reality and neurotic illusion prevents him from recognizing art as sophisticated tool for understanding the very social and moral realities that Freud himself values. Trilling quotes Freud's view that play's meaning might be wrapped by the author in a dreamlike obscurity because it touches deeply on personal and moral life. So ultimately, Freud is trying to see the source of reality in the maker of art. That is, if it is poem, it is the poet, and if any piece of art, then it is artist. Trilling uses the famous interpretation of Hamlet by Freud and Ernest Jones to illustrate the pitfalls of reductive analysis, the way they make analysis of Hamlet. Jones argued that Hamlet cannot act because he is incapacitated by the guilt he feels at his unconscious attachment to his mother. He argues that the Oedipus motive is not the meaning of Hamlet. Trilling says, motive is not the meaning of Hamlet anymore. Trilling asserts that changes in historical context and in personal mood. This is very important. Changes in historical context and in personal mood change the meaning of a work. He contends that artistic understanding is not a question of fact but it is of value. Trilling challenges the Freudian obsession with the creator's mind by introducing the importance of the reader. He states clearly that there is no single meaning to any work of art. The meaning of work cannot lie in the author's intention alone, but must also lie in its effect. Meaning, the audience partly determines the meaning of the work. Audience partly determines the meaning of the work. This is the argument of Trilling. In nutshell, we can say that psychoanalysis is the genealogical. Psychoanalysis is the genealogical heir to the Romanticist tradition, codifying centuries of literary intuition into a systematic science. Freud remains a militantly rationalistic positivist whose goal was the control of the night side of life through intelligence. Because Trilling, despite pointing out certain weaknesses of Freud's theory, he appreciates him also. And he says that Freud is rationalistic positivist. So rationalism, we all know, it means true knowledge comes primarily from reason and logical deduction, independent of sensory experience. Independent of sensory experience. And what is positivism? The only authentic knowledge is scientific knowledge derived from empirical observation and verification. Empirical observation, that the things that we observe by our senses or through our senses. It represents the combination of empirical grounding with rationalist ambition. So it is combination of your sense experiences and logic or reason. Trilling finds weakness of Freud's aesthetics. Yeah, because though he said that the literature or the artists have discovered the unconscious before me, he very humbly admits this fact. But still, Sigmund Freud undermines literature, undermines art. So, Trilling finds weakness of Freud's aesthetics, arguing that his view of art as a substitute gratification, not pure gratification, or narcotic, is fundamentally inadequate. Trilling insists that the poet is in command of his own fantasy, unlike the narcotic who is possessed by it. Trilling critiques Oedipus' motive in Hamlet, asserting that artistic understanding is not a question of fact but of value. He concludes that the analyst cannot scientifically prove an author's unconscious intention without dreamer's free association. Ultimately, Freud's specific aesthetic judgments were limited by his naive scientific principle, who says Trilling. Despite this fact, his understanding of the mind remains important, Trilling argues, and suggests that psychoanalysis should illuminate rather than solve, respecting the multiplicity of meaning inherent in great literature. So this is how, on the one hand, we find that Trilling appreciates Freud for certain reason. At the same time, he criticizes Sigmund Freud's theory of psychoanalysis and particularly his views on art and literature. Thank you. Thank you so much.